Okay, I'm Merritt Fox from the Columbia Law School, and I'm going to be moderating this first session. We've been uplifted by Professor Seligman's keynote address on flourishing, and indeed the title of this first session is Flourishing. I'll introduce the speakers, all of the speakers, now, and then each will have about 25 minutes, and then we'll have commentary and questions. So no introduction is needed, really, for Ned Phelps. As we all know, he's the director of the Center on Capitalism and Society, the McVickar Professor here at Columbia, and the 2006 Nobel Prize winner in economics. Next to Professor Phelps is Richard Robb, who is a professor of professional practice and international finance here at SEPA, and the CEO and co-founder of Christofferson and Robb. And I should say that Ned Phelps is going to talk to us about the good life from ancients to madness, and Richard Robb is going to talk about the other side of neoclassical choice, self-justifying activities, and the subjective perspective. And then finally, Professor Mark Taylor from the Department of Religion at Columbia University, who will talk about the madness of choice. And finally, we're honored to have Professor Thomas Nagel, a university professor at NYU and professor of law and professor of philosophy, who will be giving us commentary on the three talks. So, Ned?
Thank you very much. I'm sorry to be producing a surfeit of myself here, but it just so happens I'm the batting leadoff in this session.
Maybe you should move the microphone.
The question of the good life is not exactly familiar ground in political economy. As has been complained by others, socialist thought, the left, does not convey a conception of the desirable economic life, a life that socialists believed their preferred system was best suited to serve. By the way, I'd be delighted if people want to take issue with anything and everything I say. It sees every economy as virtually a sausage machine amply captured by the hours the workers put in and the sausage that comes out, with close attention to how the output is distributed over the workers. Corporatist thought has no truck with the good life either, focusing instead on national development, domestic output, and social harmony. Economists who go under the banner of progressive likewise proceed in an ad hoc way. Adam Smith, the proponent of 18th century liberal capitalism, also suggested that the proto-capitalism that he was observing and talking about was better than its predecessor. He resorted to an argument that it was better for each person, so there was no need to talk about distribution, there was no need to talk about alternative wants, differences in wants among people. It was just better. It was an argument mostly by assertion. So the trouble with this entire family of approaches, seems to me, is to the choice of economic systems and economic policy, is that it overlooks or denies the importance of the means to the ostensible ends, the processes and character of the economic system by which each day products are produced, consumption provided, and jobs created. The means taken, thus the system adopted, have consequences beyond the materialist statistics. Choosing one of the relatively modern economies, modern is my synonym for dynamic, spells differing pathways and differing experiences, thus a string of modern rewards and modern hazards. It may be asked, what hope is there of arriving at a conception of the good life in view of the differences in what nations and generations chose in the past? 19th century Americans chose one thing. In the 20th century, other things were sought. I would suggest that some of these changes in focus were the result of rising wealth and the development of democracy, so that new voices were heard. In any case, in judging rival economic systems among the economically advanced economies, so-called, of the 21st century, the right criteria, surely, are people's fundamental, well-considered aspirations, not the advocacy of this or that based upon overlooking some problem or based on some misunderstanding. The humanities have things to say about the deepest desires and rewards. Humanists have thought about the ways of life that give the deepest, most lasting satisfaction, and they have accumulated several arresting insights. Now, what I want to do as quickly as I can is to just touch on the various bases, the various high points as this perspective develops. The concept of the good life, the very idea or the meaning of such a concept, of such a thing, starts with Aristotle. For Aristotle, the good life means the sort of life that people, on reflection, would choose to the extent feasible, after non-elective goods such as food and shelter are obtained. In Nicomachean Ethics, his great book, he contrasts ways of life that are just means to an end with the good life, which is not a means to some end, but rather an end in itself, lived for its own sake. Aristotle recognizes that a certain amount of money-making is forced on society. But I think we can doubt that Aristotle would have made an effort spanning many years to develop his thesis had he believed that the good life was affordable only to a few, and never would be affordable to more than that. Aristotle implies that the pursuit of the good by a person making his entire life on a deserted island, even a rich island, would not compare to pursuit of the good in cities, in a society, in other words. Thus, he recognizes the many interactions and complementarities, even at the level of ideas, among people in a society. As a consequence, Aristotle suggests, a society needs to decide what the good life consists of in choosing the economic institutions to support and the culture to transmit in school. We should try to grasp, he says, in outline at any rate, what the good is. Some of Aristotle's finest passages are about what the good life is not. It is not doing the correct thing. You could be miserable being virtuous if you had no sense of the right track to be on. The idea of the good life conveys a humanist spirit. There's a way to live that is good for people. Whatever the particular conception of the good that a nation or a people might have, the good life always means the inner condition, the state of mind, the feeling that people seek in their lives. This is not the idea of a godly life, such as the idea in some religions that men and women have the function of utilizing resources to survive and reproduce themselves in order that another generation might survive and reproduce themselves, and so on, over and over in the future. Aristotle hastens to explain that although the good life is something that humans strive for and find gratifying, a good life is not one of amusement. It's a more purposeful kind of life. And he jokes somewhere that it's okay to take some time off for entertainment because that'll re-energize you for work the next day. So we see that Aristotle's subject is the character of the paths that are right for people. He does not hold that the good life is a life of freedom, as if it did not matter what people do with freedom. Neither does he constrain the good path for a person to be one of the paths that society has left individuals free to take, as if it did not matter to him whether freedom was narrow or wide. Now, what is Aristotle's conception of the good life? It's the pursuit of knowledge. In his words, the best thing is understanding. This understanding is supreme, since understanding is the supreme element in us. He contrasts humans with animals here. The thrust of Aristotle's argument is that with increases in the ability to understand and the wealth with which to afford to understand, a person delves increasingly into the more elevated kinds of satisfactions rather than just enjoying more and more of the old ones. The satisfactions from the knowledge accumulated from the pursuit of knowledge are at the top of the hierarchy of final goods in Aristotle's mind. The narrowness, I will, let me see. He's particularly interested in knowledge that is an end rather than a means. And that's very bothersome because, after all, a huge amount of knowledge has been acquired in civilization because of its usefulness. There's another problem with the thesis in its original form. If the highest good is exclusively knowledge that is not used for anything, a society, as it becomes more and more productive or rich, will devote more and more time to the leisure activity of pursuing such knowledge which has no commercial value in the marketplace. So the theory predicts that as hourly productivity increases in a country, we'll observe at some point little or no further increases in production and sale of goods. No more effort will have been invested in increasing our productivity. It almost anticipates the arguments of Keynes and Lytton Strachey about the good life as a movement towards greater and greater leisure. Thanks to greater and greater wealth. Now, coming to more recent times, succeeding philosophers and writers, with no sense of being out of tune with the Aristotelian perspective, have focused on other kinds of knowledge and other kinds of activities. Humanist writers and philosophers after Aristotle have introduced practical knowledge, a good that is definitely not valued just for itself. Much of it informal knowledge, which does not make it into documents. In one group, there are the pragmatists, so named because they call attention to the ways that ends are pursued and the value that some ways may have and others may lack. An early figure in this group I like to mention is the poet Virgil, who admired the tremendous knowledge that went into farming in the Po Valley. Voltaire fits well into this group. Voltaire writes about how, although we know little about how to control society, that's a very complex subject, we can still embark on our own little microeconomy We can embark on our own careers. All of us can have good lives by making our own garden grow. In the middle decades of the 20th century, closer attention was paid to the nature of the satisfactions deriving from the workplace. A pioneer is John Dewey. Dewey, anticipating Hayek, understands that ordinary workers possess considerable specialized knowledge of use in the course of their work. He emphasizes the human need to exercise this knowledge in problem-solving activity. The psychologist Abraham Maslow, was mentioned earlier, in a much-read 1943 paper, drew up a hierarchy of human needs, starting with the most basic. At some point comes mastery of a trade or skill. The need comes, the highest on the ladder is self-actualization, when you have really realized your, essentially your nature and achieve the capabilities that you were well cut out to. Well cut out to achieve. John Rawls talks about acquiring knowledge of a career through development of one's talents or capacities, which he calls self-realization. Amartya Sen, who'll probably be here in a few minutes if he's not already here, in his 1992 books, takes up that point of view, examines that point of view. He argues that in his capabilities approach, any fulfillment of life will require one to acquire capabilities to do things, and choosing which capabilities to try to acquire is part of the satisfaction of the good life that Sen is obviously talking about. Sen is not imagining some joy of choosing. He's pointing to the deeper satisfactions from being competent at selecting a new route if conditions change. There's another point which may or may not have been in the back of the mind of Amartya Sen. Rawls, if you read him carefully, you can see that he tacitly postulates a neoclassical world. The probabilities of everything are known. In this world, self-realization has a very clear meaning. But in a modern economy, where the economy is really creating the future through its innovations, some basic change in the shape of the economy is almost certain from one generation to the next. And we have no foreknowledge of what that change will be. In that sort of economy, the kind of self a person develops in one scenario or one evolution may differ considerably from the kind of self that one develops in another evolution of the system. The self is neither fixed nor subject to fixed laws of motion, so it has no explanatory value. Now I come to, that was the pragmatists, now I come to the vitalists. The vitalists, I would say the pragmatists stop short of saying some of the most important things about a good life. This literature is almost arid in portraying life at its best as one long series of pragmatic exercises in problem solving, which serve to keep us engaged, not in Martin Seligman's good sense of engagement, maybe, but maybe in a duller sense of engagement, and yield the satisfaction of mastery. This conception of the good life, though it has its merits, makes no room for the thrill of imagining new possibilities and new conquests and the satisfactions that will result if the dreams are realized, and the lesser satisfactions if they are not. Life lived to the full has always been richer than the pragmatist description. Quite different conception, different from the pragmatist of the good life, was discussed by Columbia's Jacques Barzun in the 40s and 50s and 60s. we explored getting him here for this occasion, but he's 103 now, and he's not going out very much. But we did make an effort. I should also mention Harold Bloom of Yale. They talked about vitalism. The earliest vitalist might be Homer. Probably there's somebody before that. Another early vitalist I'm fond of mentioning is the sculptor Benvenuto Cellini, a larger-than-life figure of the Renaissance. Talks about making it. And in the Baroque era, Cervantes and Shakespeare dramatized the individual's quest. In the 18th century Enlightenment, such a view is reflected to some extent in some of the key figures. David Hume, disputing the rationalism of the French, gives a crucial place to the passions in decision-making and to imagination in the growth of society's knowledge. At the dawn of the modern era, the Romantics were wild about exploration and celebrated discovery, as well as the determination and perseverance it often takes. Next, there were the philosophers of modernity. No American philosopher wrote of vitalism with more energy than William James did. He saw great vitality with his own eyes. Born in New York City in 1842, he was witness to the transformation of the American economy over the next 60 years. At the turn of the century, the notion quietly rises that there is a fixed self, but you don't start off on day one knowing very well what that self is. And from this point of view, life is a journey of self-discovery. Through a series of trials and experiences, we discover who we are. I have fun quoting Lady Gaga on this subject. I'll read it to you. Since you scoff, let me read it to you. This new album is about rebirth in every sense. It's about being able to be reborn over and over again throughout your life, until you find the identity inside yourself that defines best who you are and that makes you most feel like a champion of life. I like that expression very much. My reservation about that is that it assumes that there's a fixed self, and in discussions with Nate, Robb over there, and others, I become increasingly persuaded of the view, and Richard's Senate too. I've been increasingly persuaded that there is no fixed self, and at the New York Philharmonic concert last Saturday, when they were doing Henry V with Christopher Plummer orating, there was a line spoken by Prince Hal: I have turned away my former self. A raft of new ideas in the area of vitalism comes from Friedrich Nietzsche. Richard Robb has rather quickly become a leading Nietzsche scholar, so I will forbear from expounding any of Nietzsche, except to say that our work on projects in Nietzsche's view meets an inner need, not a need for some cash. The overcoming of obstacles is the source of the satisfaction in Nietzsche's view. In Nietzsche's theory, overcoming obstacles is the source of the satisfaction. The projects are their own reward. When in college I read Henri Bergson, I had no idea that he was repeating so much of Nietzsche. I don't know why we weren't asked simply to read Nietzsche instead of reading Bergson. Maybe it was because Nietzsche was considered a bit beyond the pale and politically incorrect at that time, while Bergson was taken to everybody's bosom. But Bergson's interesting. He talks about the élan vital, which could be thought of as the coursing of new ideas and products through society, through processes of innovation, which keep us going and nourish our vitality. I want to say just in 2 minutes or 3 minutes time, I want to say I added a bit to my draft yesterday because I realized I've said very little about personal creativity. Bergson uses the word creativity in the title of his book, but doesn't talk about any individual and any individual's creativity. Nietzsche wrote of a person as carving out his or her own values, the lines between good and evil, but he does not speak of the great satisfactions of creating a symphony or a book or any other product, even though he was an amateur composer. Some literary critics and biographers have seen creativity as a central subject of literary criticism. Lionel Trilling wrote of literature as the human activity that takes the fullest and most precise account of variousness, possibility, complexity, and difficulty. Matthew Arnold spoke of the sense of exercising free creative activity in ways other than in producing great works of literature and art. He understood there was a unity between creating works of art and creating a product or many other things. Creativity was a frequent subject of Arthur Koestler's books, such as The Act of Creation and The Sleepwalkers, Irving Stone's Lust for Life, Joyce Carey's The Horse's Mouth, the Michael Lee screenplay Topsy-Turvy about Gilbert and Sullivan. But I think we often have to turn to writers of fiction in hopes of finding an insight into the forces driving people in a creative act. And here I quote, I won't read it because it's completely over the top, but I quote a paragraph by Howard Phillips Lovecraft in which he evokes the exhilaration, intoxication of his protagonist about ready to embark on a journey of exploration and possibly discovery. Well, so just to end, so this is a new way of thinking about Aristotle. Aristotle can be considered to be not so much an advocate of studying the physical world, which would be, in his eyes, of no particular practical value. He can be reread, I think, as a champion of searching and exploring and investigating, experimenting in all areas. And we have to recall in 4th century BC, those weren't a lot of areas. But if Aristotle were alive today, I feel sure that he would be recognized as a fundamental thinker of the vitalist kind. He is, after all, the seminal creator of the concept of flourishing.
Thank you very much, Ned and Richard. I actually, if we can hold the questions till the end? Sure. Okay. So I guess we have a moment, so yes, please.
It's a very nice overview, Professor Phelps, but what is your personal opinion about the subject matter?
About what?
About the subject matter.
Oh, man, is that man? I've become more and more of a vitalist, and I think the reason I wrote this essay is I felt I needed it in a book that makes the case for an economy of dynamism. By that I mean not a Schumpeterian type of economy, that passively waits for some deus ex machina outside the economy, one of Spiethof's great scientists or great navigators, to hit upon some change in the face of the world. Instead, I mean an economy in which people in everyday life are constantly tinkering and experimenting and dreaming up new ways of doing things and new things to produce, so that the whole economy is a process of creating. And to show that many thinkers in the past have valued that kind of life, I found it natural to review the humanist literature on the good life. I hope that answers the question. I'm not sure that it does, but.
Thanks. You know, whatever we decide happiness is, it was a very happy day for me to be here to discuss these topics and to be here with my students and people who've come from faraway places like Argentina and Mexico and Europe and North Carolina and New Hampshire, Upper East Side, and and sticking with Aristotle, he said that young people can be accomplished in the mathematics or geometry, but young people with good judgment are not to be found, because good judgment involves the knowledge of universals and particulars, and it takes some time to acquire knowledge of particulars. Now, as we're channeling Aristotle today, I wonder what he would have said if he had met Karen Lee, who 1 or 2 years out of college has shown such great judgment and wisdom in organizing this conference, which is much larger than any scale that we've had in our 9 conferences. So I thank Karen for all of her great efforts over the last few months. Well, let's begin at the beginning in the opening section. Oh, you know, Marty, also, I will say in happiness, too, that I had we had the great fortune of Ned and Nate and I went to see a baseball game, and we saw Derek Jeter get his 3,000th hit. And, you know, like your own memory, that one is right up there, too, as a collective experience with so many people. In the opening section of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle says that our pursuits are of 2 types. There are those that are driving towards an end or a state, or an activity or a process. And if you're an economist, the kind of your focus on human action is just towards one of those 2 types. It's towards the humans have a desire to bring about certain states. Our view of the world looks like that, where we care about our utility as a function of some variables. I'll use C for consumption in the current period, what we expect to get in the next period, discounted, and so on. Now, I don't mean to suggest that C has to be consumption. It can be altruism. It can be, environmental concerns, the existence of the number of fish in the sea. It can be other people's utility that interlocks with your own. I don't mean to create a straw man of economics who just cares about consumption or leisure. What I want to focus on is the states, that there's no place in this maximization problem for the journey, for getting there. Whatever it is you care about the marginal. When you decide what action to take, you care about the marginal benefit it gives you in terms of that equation divided by the marginal cost that you have to spend, and that's how you go on about your decision making in choice over time. Since Samuelson proposed this in 1937, it's become a foundation of how economists think about time. And departures from this equation are seen to be signs of lack of discipline and irrationality, the inability to commit or organize oneself over time. But I'd like to start by poking away at this because it is so fundamentally embedded in the way that we think about this. When you're choosing at any moment, okay, this is what I want to do, what is it that you're maximizing at this moment? Well, maybe it's I think I've got 3 equations in this presentation, and the theory is you lose half your audience with each equation, but only one person has left so far, so I find that inspirational. If the way you're looking at the world is this, okay, I have some sense of my own well-being. It depends on the utility I get from consumption today, and then the well-being I expect tomorrow, discounted. Okay? If that's my model, okay, I can imagine substituting next period's well-being and next period's, and that will allow me to get that geometric discounting that we saw on the previous slide. Okay, that equation is consistent with this model of what you're doing in each period. I care about what I'm getting now and how I'm going to look tomorrow. But let's think for a moment about the kind of mental acrobatics that this type of thinking requires. When I make my decision today, I only care about tomorrow's guy. I don't care about day after tomorrow. I don't care about Sunday's person. I only care about Sunday's person to the extent, in the sense that I know that Saturday's person is going to care about Sunday's incarnation. But it's quite an extraordinary kind of thought process. And it also, if I'm making my decisions this way in terms of days, it means I'm not making them in terms of months or in terms of years. There has to be one and only one natural time frame for human decision-making with respect to intertemporal choice. And so, I mean, if you're willing to assume both of those things, yes, you get geometric discounting, but I find it peculiar, and that it would somehow become our definition of rationality is even more peculiar. In my paper, and we don't have the time to cover it now, I have another proposition, or a theorem really, that shows that under very general circumstances, that if a person is trying to maximize their current period consumption plus any function whatsoever of discounted future well-being, as long as that person lives for 3 periods and that function satisfies certain very basic regularity conditions, that there cannot be a solution to the person's intertemporal choice, that they get tied up in knots, that you get to a point where you have to stop calculating. It's like, Keynes' animal spirits, which I think is a wonderfully profound term, which has sadly been sort of dumbed down to mean irrational exuberance, where the animal represents the organic nature of the experience, and the spirit is sort of the mysterious bit. Tom has used the phrase, if I can paraphrase it, that the notion of the blind spot, where at a certain point there's the thing that's doing the acting, and one has to step back and make a leap into action. There's actually some ability to even make a proof about it. Now I'm going to, it's easy to criticize. Well, let's stick with, here's, and I would like to say, that I shouldn't represent myself as a Nietzsche scholar when Professor Sidorsky and Tom Nagel are in the room, and I certainly am not, although I think that I understand this sentence in his notebooks, that becoming, which I'll equate to activities, must appear justified at every moment or incapable of being evaluated, which amounts to the same thing, which I think is a wonderful phrase. It means that there have to be some things that you can't stick in a utility function. You can't trade them this for that. You can't put a price on it. That they are self-justifying. I would call that becoming, and I might even call it flourishing. Might be a nice definition of flourishing. Something that's incommensurable with other goods and with leisure. I didn't, this is repeating the same point, but I discovered this quote recently, and I just think it's so magnificent. I want to put it up here. That marginal utility theory offers no theory of movement of any kind, being occupied with the adjustment of a given situation, that people who use it have not contributed anything to a theory of genesis, growth, sequence, change, process, or the like in economic life. That was Thorsten Veblen, The Limitation of Marginal Utility in 1909 in, of all places, the Journal of Political Economy, which is, I don't think they would publish that today. Okay, it's easy to criticize this construction of choice, but I think actually looking in Nietzsche we can find an alternative theory of human action that has a great deal of explanatory power, that the desire to overcome obstacles in time, overcoming, can motivate a great deal of action. What is it that we choose to overcome? Well, one characteristic it has to have is that it arises authentically in the course of our lives. It can't be something that is imposed upon us. Now, it doesn't feel that way. We don't talk that way. We don't express ourselves that way. Why did you do it? What's the best thing? We think, what will give me the best result? What will give me the best state? As Nietzsche said, our minds are not built to understand becoming. And I would argue, again, stealing the idea from Nietzsche, that we undertake an action for reasons that are somewhat obscure to us, and then afterwards we make up an explanation, that we conflate an explanation, and that we speak in the language of pleasure. There's even some psychological literature on that same point. Like a sleeping person who hears a bell and then puts that bell into the narrative of their dream, that's how we go about our lives and describing why we do what we do. And it can explain all kinds of things that don't yield easily to neoclassical choice. Why are we sloppy with our personal finances? You could probably spend a little less time working 1 hour less in the labor supply and be better off, have more money, more wealth if you went and organized all your papers and figured out how to sort your deductions. We don't do it because in the end, money is partly, if we conceive of it as Knight did, like a game, like an economic life, like a sport, and that's something that people try to achieve and to get. But in the end, it's got a purpose beyond consumption. Diversify less than portfolio theory would suggest. It's an embarrassment of portfolio theory that people don't actually do it. It's often said that diversification is the one free lunch in in finance. Yet why don't they do it? Because they don't want to. They want to forge their own fortunes or misfortunes and impose their will on things. And if we could slip that into our models, I think it's quite clear and close to our notions to our own personal experience. Work within a firm. Firms offer a kind of team sport against competition against the rival, a community of shared goals. And Marty asked people, there's some of my coworkers here, to conduct the experiments to close their eyes and imagine some task that they perform each week that they don't like. I'm sure that they were unable to do that because it's all fun. But more education. You can't justify all the education in terms of maximizing the present value of revenues. But it's an obstacle that people set, they overcome. My students, you should cover your ears for this one, students, but they work very hard for grades, and we have the notion that somehow will translate into jobs. It really doesn't, but still they're nice, clear rules, and we do it, and I think it's all very healthy. And there are many other examples that we don't have time to go over here, but I do so in my paper. In the dual way that we experience reality of the immediate present and our imagined future, it goes together with a parallel idea of our interior perspective of the world, of a very personal, creaturely information and perspective, with an attempt to have an objective perspective on that same world, to quote, to paraphrase, probably very badly, a book that has had a very great influence on me. And I'd like to illustrate my point with a story. The best trade ever was not when John Paulson shorted the mortgage market in the United States. Best trade ever was when Pharaoh and Joseph together decided, when Joseph interpreted Pharaoh's dream predicting 7 years of abundance followed by 7 years of drought, and acting on inside information of the highest order, they accumulated grain, and it worked out very well for them. Okay. They bought grain during the good years, and then when the drought came, Joseph was able to bring in his father and his brothers into the land of Goshen. Pharaoh bought up all kinds of land in Egypt and outside of Egypt. They expanded their wealth, and it was a great trade. This has nothing to do with my talk, but if you want an example justifying speculation, look at this one, because here the speculators got it right, and the people that were able to live and not die, as the Bible puts it, which they would not have done under these circumstances. But I think this story teaches us a much deeper lesson. When Joseph told Pharaoh about the dream, Pharaoh said, well, what should I do? And Joseph said, well, you need a discerning and wise person to assist you in buying the grain. Now, why discerning and wise? Why not someone who was skilled at logistics or had experience working on big projects before? Well, 7 years is a long time to wait and to be buying grain, and the sun is shining and the harvests are bountiful, and Joseph and Pharaoh are buying grain. Okay, now they're all going to start. The rivals of Joseph are going to start to point their fingers. Joseph himself is going to start to doubt. He has a track record. Okay, he predicted when he was in jail that he had a dream that the cupbearer would be set free and that the baker would be hung, and both of those came true. But he also had a dream that he would reign over his brothers, and that hadn't come true yet. Anyway, track records come and go. And what if he had misinterpreted the dream? Or what if there were hidden conditions? And as time passes, the memory of his prophecy is going to start to dim. He's not going to be able to remember what it's like to feel prophecy. And he certainly can't communicate that to other people. Pharaoh was able to see it firsthand, but nobody else was. So how do you keep everybody on side during all those rich years from wanting to pull the plug on this, from Pharaoh and the Egyptians and Joseph himself? You're going to need wisdom and discernment. There are also extra powers given to Joseph. Pharaoh goes and he gives him his signet ring and puts a medal on him and makes him number 2 in command. Far more authority than you would think that the grain buyer would need. It's because he cannot transmit his knowledge, I would like to call it experiential knowledge, to use, again, Aristotle's term, to other people. And the great punchline to me of this story is that, according to the biblical commentary, the drought didn't even last for 7 years, but God ended it after 2 years because Jacob gave his blessing to Pharaoh. So there was no true model anyway. This insider information wasn't even exactly right. And, to me, the first thing we can conclude from this is that we can learn a lot from this story about the financial crisis. I think it tells you exactly what happens, because when markets start to freeze up, you have people who are involved in investing, trading, at banks, funds. Okay, they have maybe experiential knowledge of the details of these things, but then there are other people who who need to have their say before they can deploy resources as prices are falling. And they cannot beam their experiential knowledge into the head of the other people. So the notion that, oh, if there's transparency, then everyone can see what's happening and that the magic will kick in and markets will find equilibrium. But to the extent that, one, there is no true model that describes the world, that we're not all trying to decide there's some variables we know, people have different views on what those variables are, and that the information about them are possessed from a very subjective perspective. So each person has something they would like to do, but nobody can say what is true because there isn't one. If we give up on this notion that there is a true model that generates the world, then, and that people are transformed by their experience over time, then we end up with a very different idea about the way markets work. And I don't think we can get at that truth without considering this. So if our notion of the kinds of knowledge that people have is what it's like to be something, the things that philosophers tell the fable of Mary the scientist who has lived in a room her whole life. She's only seen black and white. She knows all about the biology of the eye and the physics of light. But can she know what it's like to see the color red without ever seeing the color red? What if, rather than that being an issue in philosophy of science, all the things that many of the things that we know are about what it's like to be something rather than theoretical information, subjective information that we cannot transmit. And I would differentiate that, from, let's say, it's most closely perhaps linked to Polanyi's tacit knowledge. But even in a model where everybody knows the state of the world, where it's generated by some model, you still have to learn how to ride a bicycle, which can only be done personally. You can't read about that in a book. I mean, even personal knowledge or experiential knowledge of prophecy, it might not even be right, but it's something that you've experienced that transformed you, that frames and shapes your view of the world. I don't have a lot of time, but to quickly mention some consequences. So often one hears calls for transparency as a solution to making markets better. Align interests and minimize asymmetric information, reduce transactions costs, and things will take care of themselves. But not if people can't share or communicate their knowledge. They need privacy. They need to be able to engage in long-term projects without interference or intervention of others. That an efficient market, as I argue in the paper and we'll just hint at here, will find a balance between privacy and transparency. And one can make examples where trying to mark things to market, which economists are contemptuous of cost accounting, of holding things at fixed value because it's some sort of denial. But one can easily create examples where attempting to mark to market creates signals that will be rationally misinterpreted by people. One more point, one last equation. What does it mean to make a long-term decision? We think of patience, okay? Economists can model patient people and impatient people. But if we're all discounting at the same interest rate on the margin, we really don't have any notion of long-term strategic vision. What's best in the short term is best in the long term. The dynamic programming tells us this, that you maximize value by maximizing the payoff right now, plus the value of what you've got left over at the end. And, but if people have conviction that they can't share, then long-term means that they have to be left without interference to make decisions from their subjective and experiential knowledge without having to worry that their provisional nature of their resources, which all command over resources is generally provisional, will be impaired over time. It's a nice theory, Camus said, for a thought to change the world, it must first change the life of a person. When you see entrepreneurs walk around with their business plan, they make people sign confidentiality agreements before they'll show it to them. But nobody's going to steal their idea. The confidentiality agreements aren't even enforceable. entrepreneur has been transformed, other people have not. And that's why they have to start with their own money or people who they can overlap with, who can share their very personal experiential knowledge, and then gradually become more theoretical and bring in different types of finance. And it's a model of quests as well. Quests too have to unfold over time. You can't have a quest in a day or a week. That it's something where one has to have privacy for activity over time. I'm near the end of my time, so I would like to bring in one, if we have these notions of the immediate present and states of the world in the future of subjective knowledge, theoretical knowledge, it would be very nice to have a unified view of them. In a magnificent statement to me in the book, The View from Nowhere, the pursuit of a highly unified conception of life in the world leads to philosophical mistakes, to false reductions, and the refusal to recognize part of what is real. Skipping to another section, part of the book, we are small creatures in a big world. Or, as economists might say, if there was an easy way to unify these perspectives, somebody would have done it by now. I don't have a way to do it, but I think that not only can we have models by recognizing both sides of these dualities, of the objective, becoming, flourishing, self-justifying activities, and as well as the states of the world, experiential knowledge, and the subjective perspective, in addition to an objective theoretical perspective where everyone has a common model, that not only can we have models that can explain a great deal of observed behavior without resorting to mental deficiencies and bounded rationalities and things like that, that I personally find very unsatisfying. I hope we can have something that resonates more closely with our own experience of reality. Okay, I'm just at the end of my time, so I'll turn things over.
Thank you very much, Richard.
Fulfill my divine work as creative.
Well,
Yes.
just to pick up on this discussion
This will be the last question. Thank you.
that was just beginning to develop. Ned, I thought when you set the problematic for this that you were worried that modern capitalism, finance capital-driven capitalism, is bad for human flourishing. And your comments just now suggest to me that you are worried about that. And that in fact it's not a question of opening up this capitalist system to more and more people, but that the system may be inoperable for the good of ordinary workers today. And I wonder if we shouldn't really be talking about, if that's the case, and I believe it's the case, I don't think finance capitalism is by any means democratic. I think it's very destructive to most human beings. We're seeing that in what's happening in the world now. Whether the discussion we really have to have is what would be the alternative to that? Can we think a new kind of socialism that isn't the kind of totalitarian socialism we had in the past? Or some other version of a productive system which doesn't naturalize what we have now as the way things have to be, that could enable human flourishing. And I take in short, I mean, I take the name of your center seriously. It's about capitalism and society. Maybe those two words can be joined together by and. It may be capitalism or society. And so I think it's at least something worth us discussing.
Well, Richard, I guess this is really a very long conversation that we have to have sometime, but speaking quickly and as concisely as I could, I skipped over a few things. when I was talking about an economy of dynamism, a modern economy, I was thinking of American capitalism when it became modern, when it became innovative, which wasn't right away by any means, but around the 1830s, right through the 1930s, and some would say right up until 1970. I'm not oblivious to the perversion of the system that has set in. I don't know exactly when it has set in, but it would be hard to put, but it's probably a series of events, each of which have reduced the capacity of the economy to promote and nourish innovation and creativity and experiment and exploration and change. And I recognize that. But where I think we disagree, and probably will always disagree, is I think that a reform capitalism that goes back much more to the spirit of the earlier, the spirit of modern capitalism, 1830 to 1970, I think that's where we should be looking for pay dirt, and not going back to a socialism or corporatism, because I think those are highly inimical to creativity and innovation.
It was, however, very interesting to me to look at the data that Marty put up there about countries, and to see at significantly the top of that list Denmark. It's Denmark so high at the top of that list, which is at least a variation on some of what I think you're after, Richard.
Actually, I think the burden of the discussion of Ned's paper, I think all three of the papers, was what are the standards we should use in evaluating an economic system. I think in Ned's case it was clear that the emphasis on creativity was meant as a reason, one reason to assign a high value to capitalism. But whatever your higher order, your answer to that higher order question, maybe it doesn't determine the answer to the evaluation of a particular type of economic system without a lot of empirical results.
Do you believe that capitalism, you said before you thought that capitalism was a democratic system?
Well, I think it's democratic in the sense that